What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a class overview for the Ranger in Baldur's Gate 3 ahead of the game's official launch, where we'll be talking about the class fantasy of a Ranger on top of some of its many class mechanics available in Baldur's Gate 3. And while we've done several of these so far, some of them are pretty good guides for 5th edition D&D as a whole, but in the case of the Ranger in particular, Larian has made some significant changes to their class mechanics in order for them to feel up to par in Baldur's Gate 3. Because if you're unaware, Rangers in 5th edition D&D, while I wouldn't outright say they're bad or anything, they have a lot of class mechanics that are very situational. For instance, in the tabletop version of the game, they have an ability called Favored Enemy that allows them to get advantage on tracking certain enemies, and while that can be useful in certain situations, if you're not playing a module where you need to track something, that doesn't do you any good. And that's just one of many examples. So as we go through this and talk about Rangers, do understand that significant changes have been made to them in Baldur's Gate 3, and that's what we're going to be talking about specifically. That said, I like to kick these videos off talking a bit about the class fantasy of said class, and Rangers are an interesting case because in a somewhat similar sense to Paladins, in the early editions of the game, Rangers were required to be of a good alignment. Unlike Paladins, they had a little bit of wiggle room there. They could be lawful good or chaotic good, but they had to be good. This was a requirement that was dropped all the way back in, I believe it was 3rd edition, as nothing about a Ranger really necessitates them to be good. But the reason that alignment restriction ever existed in the first place is that as a class fantasy, Rangers are meant to be defenders of civilization, but on the fringes of society. They are wardens of forests. They are protectors of isolated villages, that kind of thing. They are very much so a sort of predator working their way through the untamed wilds of the world, working and living in places other people would find incredibly difficult to do so. This has seen them pick up a variety of combat methods that allow them to both commune with nature but also be very self-reliant. They are a fiercely independent type of person, and while they have been known to work with gatherings of druids, among others, when a need arises, generally these are people that are loners and left to their own devices. As such, they are skilled hunters, they are used to living off the land, and in case you are wondering, it is not a coincidence that they might remind you of Aragorn from Lord of the Rings, because some of their original versions of the Ranger were very much so based on Lord of the Rings and specifically the character Aragorn. By the time Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rolled around, the 2nd edition that is, they started incorporating other inspirations such as Robin Hood, for instance. But however you want to look at it, Rangers are incredibly skilled outdoorsmen who have learned to commune with nature to cast a limited selection of spells, which is one of many tools at their arsenal that makes them deadly hunters. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about some general information for Rangers, such as their proficiencies and primary ability scores. Now, ability score-wise, Rangers typically rely off of dexterity and wisdom. It is possible to make a strength-based Ranger, though typically that's not very common, especially if you're actually putting levels into Ranger. Primarily because they used ranged weapons such as bows a lot, which use dexterity, and then they often use finesse weapons, which attack rolls use dexterity, so while strength is possible, it is unusual. And then they need wisdom for their casting stat, as Rangers are in fact half casters, and their magic comes from a very similar place as druids, so they use wisdom as well. Proficiency-wise, right out of the gate, they are proficient with light and medium armor, as well as simple and martial weapons. Next, I want to talk a little bit about their spellcasting ability. As I mentioned, they are half casters and they use wisdom as their casting stat, but more specifically, a lot of their spells revolve around either buffing or augmenting their ranged or potentially melee attacks with things such as Hunter's Mark, which causes extra damage when you hit an enemy, and if that enemy dies, you can recast Hunter's Mark, and it just gives you a little bit of extra damage. They also have a spell called Ensnaring Strike, which can ensnare enemies you hit with attacks, potentially. So a decent amount of a ranger's spell list goes into augmenting their attacks in some way. However, they also have other spells centered around restoration, or potentially things like speaking with animals or communing with nature in some way. So it's important to understand that while a ranger is in fact a half caster, a lot of their spells are important to, in essence, getting the most out of using them as a character, because if you're not applying something like Hunter's Mark when you're in combat, you're going to have a bad time. And the nice thing about Hunter's Mark is that if you kill an enemy with it, you can freely recast it without using up spell slots. So if you're not doing that, you're actively hurting your experience and you're going to kill your damage a little bit. Basically meaning that they have a lot of spells that they need to utilize to get the most out of the character. Now from there, we're going to talk a little bit about the class mechanics, and this is initially where there were a lot of changes made. So in Baldur's Gate 3, we will be picking a favored enemy. However, in the tabletop version, all favored enemy does is give you a bonus, so to speak, on wisdom survival checks to track enemies, as well as give you languages your favorite enemy might speak. And in a game like Baldur's Gate 3, that's just not going to be useful. So they changed that pretty much entirely, a complete rework. We have these 5 options you can see on screen here. Each of them will give you a proficiency in a skill now, while also providing some other sort of benefit. For instance, Bounty Hunter will cause enemies you hit with Ensnaring Strike to have disadvantage on their saving throws. Or you could pick something like Ranger Knight, which will actually give you proficiency in history, but also give you heavy armor proficiency right out of the gate. And this, just right off the bat, gives a pretty big boon to rangers that can be useful in a variety of situations. And they continue this trend with Natural Explorer, which has also seen significant reworks. Natural Explorer in the tabletop version allows you to pick a favored terrain, which would give you a variety of bonuses to mostly just traveling in the TTRPG, which again isn't super useful in a game like Baldur's Gate 3. So they reworked this as well to either provide resistances to certain elements or granting us sleight of hand proficiency, with another option giving us the ability to use Find Familiar at will. Though if you're going Beastmaster, I don't imagine that would be super useful for you. Nonetheless though, some nice benefits to what would otherwise be something useless in a game like this. While we're talking about large changes though, something else they seem to have done is gotten rid of Primeval Awareness altogether. At 3rd level in the TTRPG, Rangers would be able to use Primeval Awareness to spend a turn and a Ranger spell slot to sense if certain types of enemies were present in the surrounding area, which would gain bonuses if you were in your favored terrain. Again, this just isn't something useful in Baldur's Gate 3, and it looks like they cut this one all together. I couldn't find it anywhere. And given there are already significant changes to Favored Enemy and Natural Explorer, that's not a huge surprise to me. But moving on from there, at 2nd level, Rangers get to pick up a fighting style, though it has to either be archery, defense, dueling, or 2-weapon fighting, meaning that a lot of their fighting styles again lean into more dex-based combat primarily, but either way you'll get to pick one of those fighting styles, which will confer a small bonus to you in regards to those things, so naturally pick the one you want to specialize in. And then at 5th level, like most other martial classes, they will get an extra attack at level 5, allowing them to attack twice instead of once in a single turn. Now, past that, there are a few more abilities that a ranger would get up to the level cap of Baldur's Gate 3, which will be level 12 for the full game. I'm going to go over them, but do understand, because of the significant changes the ranger has already seen, these might not be implemented in exactly this way. I think it's actually pretty likely in some cases. But at 8th level, we can pick up Land's Stride. This basically means we can move through difficult terrain without it actually being difficult terrain, which includes moving through non-magical plants that would otherwise hurt you or something and not being hurt by them. This also gives us advantage on saving throws against plants that are magically created, such as Entangling Vines from the Entangle spell. And then at 10th level, they pick up Hide in Plain Sight, which allows them to spend an action to effectively blend blend into their surroundings, which gives them a large bonus to stealth checks. I would assume these two will likely make it into the game with some sort of variation, but up to the level cap of 12, that's all the mechanics you need to worry about. Which brings us to the Ranger's subclasses. There will ultimately be 3 of these: Hunter, Beastmaster, as well as Gloomstalker. 2 of these are in the game right now in early access, Hunter and Beastmaster, and then Gloomstalker will be added at launch. Now when it comes to Ranger subclasses, 5th edition D&D likes to add a little bit of flair to essentially every type of subclass to give them a little bit of lore significance. In the case of the Ranger, their archetypes are based off of ideals that they follow. So a hunter is typically seen as having accepted their role as protectors of the fringes of civilization, whereas the Beastmaster embodies the friendship between man and animal and takes on an animal companion to represent that. But to start with the hunter, this is a subclass that focuses on your martial prowess. Right away, you'll be able to pick one of several abilities that will give you an advantage in combat, typically allowing you to make some sort of extra attack or deal more damage. With this really being exemplified by the Hunter's level 11 ability, Multi-Attack, which allows you to make a ranged attack against any number of creatures within 10 foot of a point you can see, or Whirlwind Attack, which allows you to make a melee attack against any enemy within 5 feet of you, with you getting as many attacks as there are enemies. So that one is much more about dealing as much damage to as many enemies as possible. But then we have Beastmaster. This one's pretty self-explanatory. You get an animal companion to join you in combat. As you level up with this subclass, the animal companion is capable of doing more and more for you, including doing things like getting extra attacks itself. You can pick from one of a few different animal companions, each with their own main ability that they can do, and it's a relatively simple system here in early access, so this might see some expansion, but as it stands, it's a nice touch. That leaves us with our last one though, which is Gloomstalker. Gloomstalker, while not in the early access period, is a sort of stealth and ambush focused ranger. They get a few extra spells such as Disguise Self or potentially Fear, and then right away when you take that subclass, you get bonuses to your initiative based off your wisdom modifier. On the first turn of combat, you have faster movement speed, and then if you attack on that first turn, you can actually make an additional weapon attack that specific turn as well, and if that attack hits, you deal more damage, again kind of symbolizing that ambush mechanic. They also get a unique ability that makes them immune to any creature trying to see them with dark vision. That is to say, if they are in darkness and the only way a creature could normally see them is with dark vision, then that creature just can't see them. And then later on, they get to basically re-roll an attack if they miss. So once on every one of their turns, they'll get the opportunity to make another attack if they miss with an attack, giving them more chances to deal more damage. So as you can see, Gloomstalker is more about a sort of stealthy approach to combat and dealing even more damage, especially right at the start of combat, to symbolize an ambush. So when it comes to actually playing a ranger, as you've probably picked up on, they're good at a few things in particular. For starters, they make very, very good archers, which should come as no surprise really. But between the spells that will add damage to their ranged attacks on top of the archery fighting style, they can get some really good damage as an archer. It's also possible to turn them into a dex-based fighter very, very easily if that's what you want to do, which means that Rangers can play a very solid role in your DPS lineup, especially ranged martial DPS or just being an archer. There's only a couple of classes that really excel at that, with the ranger being one of them. And then you add in their ability to do something like get an animal companion, which can help you turn the action economy in your favor by simply giving you more turns, and their utility-focused spellcasting, which might help you out when it comes to healing here and there, can potentially be very useful as well. Now, generally speaking, especially in the tabletop version of D&D, the problem with Rangers is that they tend to just be a very situational class to play, and that may or may not wind up being the case in Baldur's Gate 3, as we simply don't have access to the full game yet, but once we do, we'll know for sure exactly how that winds up playing out. But it's a class that comes with a pretty rigid play style, and how big of an impact some of Larian's changes to the class here wind up having will ultimately remain to be seen. But the good news is, if you want to play an archer that has an animal companion with them, Baldur's Gate 3 has done a good job of getting a ranger up to speed in that regard. With that in mind, let's talk about a couple of multi-classing options as we move to wrap this video up. So there are two classes that are really common to multi-class a ranger with because they both use the same casting stat, which is Druid and Cleric. A Druid multi-class will allow you to potentially focus on shape-shifting into an animal while having an animal companion if you go Beastmaster. It's also a convenient way to get more spells. And then there is Cleric, specifically Nature Cleric, with their Channel Divinity ability allowing you to charm animals and plants. And then if you take Cleric all the way to level 6, you'll even get an ability that within 30 feet makes you resistant to elemental damage, potentially at the cost of a reaction, and combined with its very nature-based extra spell list will thematically fit in with a ranger very well. Though a third option is actually to multi-class ranger with rogue. Sneak attack by being a rogue is quite good simply because you can get sneak attacks when you attack with advantage, and then that combined with the cunning action will give you extra bonus actions, which as a class that uses spells with a lot of bonus actions like Hunter's Mark for instance, this can be very useful. And then if you grab expertise, you can even make yourself incredibly good at a few specific skill checks, which can work incredibly well if you're trying to use stealth with, say, a Gloomstalker Ranger. So you have some options there with multi-class, and potentially it might actually make the base class itself of a Ranger even more compelling of an option when you mix it with some specific classes for certain things. But to wrap this video up and not go on too long, when it comes to the Ranger, what a lot of it really comes down to is how well some of these changes Larian have made ultimately wind up being. And with any luck, they're great, and the Ranger actually manages to keep up with the rest of the classes in terms of power, because while a Ranger might lack some of the many options other classes have, what they do provide is a really thematic way to play the game that can potentially offer you things such as an animal companion, or just some really solid damage in certain instances. So again, with any luck, the changes that they have made will be genuinely impactful on the rest of the game outside of early access, but that's something we'll have to wait and see on. But either way, it's a class with a strong identity and class fantasy, and that's something I'm a big fan of. That though is going to do it for this particular video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.